Dan, thanks for inviting me. So I think the idea really is to try and give you a feeling for the soil classification system we use and, the various elements in that, and I'll sort of go through that. And also then just to start thinking about how we've mapped the data and perhaps different approaches we use for that. And as I do so, to try and highlight the difference between taxonomic classification and then the sort of cartographic presentation of the data. So our system, the soil classification system that we have here relating to England and Wales, and I'll come back to that in a minute, is a hierarchical system. And the hierarchical system is based on shared characteristics for all the soils, right the way from the very top down to the individual soil types. And it's based on properties which, like parent material, the material that the soil comes from, the drainage, the texture of the soil, and so on. And effectively, the classification tries to standardize an understanding of the range and span of soil types that we'll have. The classification system itself, as you can see here, is formed on a sort of pedogenetic basis. That's a crazy word, but pedogenetic simply means something that relates to the way that soils form and the development of soils, sort of processes, pedogenesis as it's called. Examples of the processes that may apply to soil are things like weathering, of course, leaching of minerals as they pass down through the soils, the movement of fine clay particles, and they migrate through the soil, glaying, podsilization, the way that organic matter changes as well in the soil. So these pedogenetic processes take place, and from that we can start to look at patterns that can be predicted. The idea of the classification then is to identify boundaries in this spectrum, and those boundaries give us precisely defined mutually exclusive classes. At least that's the idea. In reality, there's a lot of battles about which soil type of certain soils were, but what we've arrived at is a set of a national correlation where there's agreement, and the same classification applies across England and Wales. Now, the characteristics in the soil also have a number of practical significant characteristics of practical significance, and that gives us a number of applications, and we'll come back to that. But let's start to think about the actual hierarchy of the system. And we have here, I have in my hand, I don't know if you can see the soil classification guide. There's two key books which Dan, I'll probably give you a link to, and you can pop into the system afterwards, or we'll put them on the portal for everyone. But there's a three-tier hierarchical system. We start off with 10 major soil groups at the highest level, and from those are derived child classes, or the soil groups, and there's 43 of those. You can see they're numbered, so 7 becomes 7.1. And then we have the soil subgroups under that. It's 118 of those. And the soil subgroups, together with the groups and the major groups, give us the broad superstructure of the soil classification. Within a particular soil subgroup, then, you have the soil types, and we call those soil series. So soil series gives us 725 of those across England and Wales. So that's a sort of basic hierarchy of the system. Let's just consider that first row, the major soil groups. And as I said, there's 10 of those, and here they are listed out. So we have, first of all, the terrestrial raw soils. So these are soils where perhaps soil is formed relatively recently. There's not really much soil development in them. These are things like dunes, scree slopes, recent alluvial deposits. So not really terribly interesting from a soil science point of view. Then you have soils that exhibit raw gley properties, and the examples given here are things like salt marsh and tidal sands. But these are soils that have been waterlogged, conditions of prolonged saturation, very little drainage. Then we have soils that are predominantly still displaying the characteristics of the rock that they come from. These are called the lithomorphic soils. And their characteristics are strongly informed by the nature of the rock that sits underneath them. So they could be quite shallow rocky soils. We have the peeler soils, which are the heavy clays, and these are very fine textured parent material, very high clay content. And these are the so-called cracking clays. I think in England and Wales we don't have the really strong vertisol where you can pretty much put your arm down the crack that you do in other parts of the world. But nonetheless, we do have cracking clays, and that's a big issue if we have structures like houses and roads and infrastructure built in them. Next is brown soils. So these are the ones you want in your garden. These are very well weathered. They have an argillic B horizon. These are moderate leaching, quite brown, quite aerated, formed under temperate grassland or deciduous woodland. Then you have the podsoils, the podzolic soils. And the podsoils are sort of very leached soils. So you very typically find these on sort of acid heaths or in coniferous areas where the nutrients have actually leached down through and are sitting well below the surface of the soil, and up above is just left perhaps a sort of a bleached layer. So these podsoils are quite distinctive for those upland heath areas. And then we have a couple of categories, 7 and 8, which is where we have seasonally waterlogged soils, and it rather depends where that water is coming from. 7 are the surface water clay soils, where effectively you have periodic waterlogging from rain, surface runoff. And 8 is where there's a water table that's coming up and saturating the soils. And there's a couple of ones just to finish off. First of all, man-made soils, the so-called technosoils. These are the soils which have come from strong human activities, let's say, and sort of, urban soils and so on. And then lastly, peat soils, which are extremely important in the climate story as well. So these are soils with at least 40 centimeters of organic material. So we'll come back to those, but that gives you a feeling for those top the top sort of 10 categories. And effectively, what we tried to do then is to come up with features that differentiate the soils at each of these 3 levels. And we can look at 3 different things. We can look at the material, the so-called parent material that the soil is deriving from. We can look at the layering that appears in the soils. These are the so-called horizons in the soil, and indeed other features that are endemic to the soil. And it is a combination of those that gives us the ability to differentiate the classes between the soils. Well, let's start thinking about the materials. So first of all, we might be considering organic or humose or mineral materials. So, organic, of course, are materials that have come from plant and animal remains that are in the soil at various stages of decomposition. Humose is soils that have high organic content, but are not not enough to be classified as an organic soil. And then, of course, the mineral soils, which are still more influenced by the parent material, the levels of clay, sand, and silt that are in the soils. And organic material may be quite low in those mineral soils. And you can see here a sort of a diagram which allows us to roughly characterize whether we're talking about peats or loamy peats, sandy peats, depending on the proportions of the different elements in them. So there's a little calculator you'll find in the soil survey book that helps identify those. We have then ways of characterizing materials. There's many materials we might consider. So we've sort of discussed organic and humose and mineral, that sort of spectrum there. But also things like the stoniness, the rockiness. So when the surveyor's in the field, they'd be looking for examples of these criteria, these diagnostic materials. How many stones are there? What's the nature of the stones? Are they large? Are they river washed? Are they fragmented? Is it gravel that's coming from alluvial deposits and so on? Also, you're looking at the levels of calcium carbonate, and I'm sure if you've been in the field, you'll have a little bottle of hydrochloric acid diluted, and you put it on the soil, and you listen to hear if you have a fizz, the carbon dioxide coming off as the acid reacts with that. You can tell whether the soil is calcareous or not. You might be looking at how much iron is there, and the colour is a good way of doing that. I'll come back to colour in a moment. And lastly, the sort of historical derivation of the soil, whether it's been deposited by water. And there's a couple of examples here of ways that soil can be deposited. So first of all, alluvial soils. So these are soils that are deposited by flowing water, rivers, streams, floodwaters, and so on. And as the water sort of slows down, the sediments drop out, and you have fine sorting. And then you also have colluvial deposits, which are where materials have actually flowed, as it were, down a hillside, down topography, down relief, and the soils appear at the bottom of the slope through gravity processes. So alluvium and colluvium, and also disturbed materials as well, can be another diagnostic characteristic. Well, let's just consider then the next thing, which is the horizons. And I'll just give a few examples here. So first of all, we might be looking at the diagnostic horizons to see if there's a PT topsoil. And here there's a soil classification, the soil classification on that tells or how you actually identify this. But these are organic materials that could be anything up to 40 centimeters thick, so quite distinct topsoil. And the PT topsoil may very well overlay mineral soils or rock as well. So, but it's that topsoil we're looking for. So we're now onto the horizons. We might then consider humose topsoils. Humose topsoils. So this is the A horizon, and here we're looking at perhaps a sequence of soils, either A or other A or OH or AH horizons in the topsoil. So here we're starting to look at colour and chroma. So I'll explain that in a moment. Then also we might look at quite distinct topsoils. So these are topsoils where it's neither peaty nor humose, but there's enough organic matter in the top sort of 15 centimeters or so, and it contains some degree of organic carbon. So these don't quite qualify as man-made. They're PT and humose. And there's a number of these diagnostic horizons we could look at. Other ones include things like earthy topsoils, man-made horizons, and so on. So surveyors looking for these diagnostic horizons. Those are the topsoils. And then as we sort of come down the profile, and looking at the subsoils and to look at the B horizon to see what there is there. And again, the colour comes into this very much. So you can see a very clear colour difference between these two soils here. And the colour is defined in terms of hue and chroma. So I'll just take a quick moment just to sort of explain this. So colour is something that soil surveyors take a lot of interest in, and there's a special book called the Munsell chart, which has very, very carefully printed colours at very predictable hues and colours in the book, and you compare the colour of the soil in the field with the colours in this Munsell colour chart. And the dominant colour, whether it's a red, yellow, brown, or greenish, is the sort of basic colour. And then the chroma that we have is I suppose the strength or the intensity of the colour. So if it's a low chroma, then you have sort of dull, greyish, washed out. High chroma colours are bright, vivid colours. So we give an example here of 2.5y, and 2.5y is quite yellow, less reddish. There's a scale from 5yr to 7.5yr, 10yr to 2.5. So we're looking at 2.5 here, and then lastly 5y. And as you go along that scale, you're getting less red and more yellow. So it's already a sort of red to yellow going across. So 2.5y colors here are typically poorly drained soils, waterlogged, and quite reduced with iron oxide. So color and the Munsell chart is a key part of the soil surveyor's toolbox in the field. We can then also look at the argillic, the nature of the argillic horizon, and the argic horizon using world reference base. And these are soils that have these are soil layers, subsoil layers, where clay has been transported down the stack, down the column of the soil, and from the upper soil layers. And that process is called alluviation. So the very fine clay particles, through a process of alluviation, pass down and coat the contents of the subsoil that was there. So an argillic horizon has a lot of clay in it, with very often these sort of clay coatings. And you can see here on the diagram, it's describing these slightly lighter alluvial clay coatings over the the darker alluvial clay coatings over the brown PEDs, so the structural blocks of the soil. So the nature of the clay in the soil, the argillic horizon, subsoils. We can also consider the nature of podsoils as they form. So this is this idea of podsoilization, where you have organic matter that is at the top of the soil, an iron and aluminium that passes down through the soil column. And again, these are, as I mentioned before, these are very characteristic of acid uplands. So I think in my I've spent some interesting times up on Dartmoor on the moor up there looking at podsoils, and these soils can be very, very characteristic of that area. The iron and aluminium gets leached down the soil column, and that tells us that we're dealing with quite acid conditions. So we have sort of heathland, woodland, moor, acid woodland, coniferous woodland, and moorland vegetation. And you'll typically find these on quite sandy, coarse textured soils where there's plenty of gaps in between the particles for the organic materials to pass down. So you have this quite characteristic dark or reddish brown horizon with organic material and iron and aluminium that gets deposited there. So the podzolic horizon. Then we also have this notion of the glade horizon, where you have, for a variety of reasons, as I mentioned, have waterlogging, poor drainage, whether it's the water table or whether it's the riverine or lacustrine or indeed marine deposits that have led to a process called chemical reduction. So there's not enough air in the soil, and the soil is saturated for prolonged periods of time, and gets itself into a quite aerobic situation, and the soil is characteristically grey, if not even green or bluey grey, with very often with mottling. So if it's not complete, then a sort of mottling process takes place with the sort of the passage of air in and out as the soil gets flooded. And lastly, the idea of some soil that is seasonally waterlogged as opposed to sort of pretty much permanently waterlogged, and the notion of slowly permeable subsurface horizons with stagnic properties. So these are the so-called stagnosols, which have temporary water saturation above a slowly permeable layer. So the water is not draining away, but it's not constantly waterlogged all the time. And sometimes water might be perched or held high in the soil profile and passes down, or maybe there's seasonal or episodic flooding of the soils, and you get that mottling that I was beginning to refer to there before. And so this idea of periodic flooding of the soils. And yeah, and also, excuse me, also we should consider the subsoils. This is going down to nearly a meter down, sort of 40 to 80 centimeters down, looking at the levels of ochreous mottling that we have here that tells us about those gley activities. So those are sort of key. It's a very high level, and I just like to stress that the book, I'm paraphrasing really, the book has details of that process where you go through it and a little guide. But at the end of that process, we have our 3 levels of hierarchy established, and we actually then identify a soil type or a soil series. And the soil series is defined here. I shan't read that out. You can read that. So, the key thing is it's got these common criteria to do with the materials, the horizons, and the features, and so on. The soils are coming from the same geological deposits, whether it's a glacial till or alluvium or sandstone. And from that, you get strong textural characteristics, the mineral characteristics of the soil. Drainage, it comes from similar formations, formation conditions, so soils that have been in the same sort of climatic condition or in the same position in a topo sequence in relief, or they're the same similar drainage, or indeed biological activities as well. And it's one of my favorite soils is in, I saw in Hungary, where a cryosol, where there were the freezing and thawing had led to very interesting patterns in the soil, combined with prehistoric animals that had burrowed through the soil. It gave it a sort of rather Swiss cheese look. So the biological activity could be very characteristic as well. And also you have consistent horizons. So once you have these things together, sort of a typical A horizon and so on, then you can start to classify into the soil types. And the idea of a soil series, then, it gives us a sort of standardized way of mapping and describing soils at the field level. So you can actually be in the field and say, this is a type, this soil type is, and give it a name. Each of the soil series we have has a full description in our national database and our LandIS database, and the national soil map and all of our soil maps at some level have soil series associated with the mapping units in different ways, as we'll see as we go through this. If we try to sort of characterize a soil series, quite a good way of thinking about this is it's rather similar to the idea of a species, a natural species in the Linnaean classification, biology's natural species. So let's just quickly think about the way that we differentiate soil series. And there's a number of ways that we can do this, and I'll come back to this perhaps in a bit more detail at the end, but it gives us the ability to differentiate at fine scales. Why do we do it? We do it to help with decisions or policy making at a land level, so we can actually classify the soils. We understand the processes that led to the soil, so this might help predict the way that different soil types or soil series can behave under different conditions. And of course, once we have clear defining characteristics for the soil, this helps us to map the soils as well. So these are some of the reasons for having this sort of clear differentiation of soils. And the sort of criteria that we could look at, and again, I'll just draw now attention to a different book, which is the criteria for differentiating soil series. And again, I'll put a copy of this for your access and on the portal as well. Can contain a number of things. So first of all, parent material lithology, soil texture groupings, and the presence of distinctive mineralogy. And in terms of soil parent lithology, so this is lithology means the characteristics of the underlying geological material, the sort of rocks that underpin, whether it's limestone or sandstone, or whether it's till from a glacier deposits, whether it's alluvia that's been deposited by water from river, lakes, and marine deposits, and so on. So the soil parent material is the key criteria. The soil groupings within the specified depths tell us about things like the drainage rate, the root penetration, workability, and the presence of distinctive mineralogy gives us the ability to look at properties of the soil. So, for example, they may have clays with high levels of smectites in them, a particular mineral, which, if you look at it under a microscope, are like lots of little dinner plates all stacked together. And smectites, of course, in heavy clay can lead to problems when they expand and contract, and water can get in between these dinner plates and push them apart, and the soil can expand, and as it dries out, contract. And so if you have something buried in the soil, that can be a problem. So shrink and swell behavior of smectite-rich clays, high levels of nutrient availability, cation exchange capacity, the soil structure, and also the different colors and chemical behaviors, things like iron oxides as well. So these criteria can be used to try to identify the different types of soil. So we're looking at the origin of the parent material, the origin, the physical behavior, and the chemical or mineral behavior of the soil. So these are the three sort of key defining criteria. And I'm just going to bring this up. There we are. So effectively, these are the types of lithologies that we may consider. Consolidated rocks within 80 centimeters. So again, that's the parent material, looking at all the different types of rock that we may have there. We have also softer substrates that are, at that sort of 80 centimeter depth. These are pre-quaternary substrates. So quaternary refers to all the geological materials and rock formations that were formed before the start of the quaternary period. So that's about 2.58 million years ago. So softer soils, parent materials. Then, of course, the drifts that have formed since that period, since 2.58 million years ago, the quaternary period, the alluvia, lake marls, colluvium, as we discussed earlier, and gravels and so on, which have been laid down and drift. So these are the sorts of lithologies that we're interested in, and of course the nature of the organic layer, the peats, the different plant remains, plant and animal remains, sphagnum moss, sedge, Molinia grass, and so on. And there we are. We consider the minerals of the soil in terms of the proportions of sand, silt, and clay. And and we have this so-called texture triangle. And so if we just use a sieving approach to look at how much sand and silt and clay, very fine clay particles, you can see the size of the particles are in the axes title. Then you can actually try to position the soil in terms of whether it's a clay or a fine loam and so on. If you have a lot of rock particles from the lithoskeletal parent materials, then you have a slightly simpler approach because you have lots of particles of rock in there. So you have the diagram on the right is slightly simpler for lithoskeletal soils with lots of particle rock fragments and particles. So the mineralogy of the soils, there we are. So first of all, we have these are the chemical and mineral compositions. So carbonatic is just how much calcium carbonate is there. The ferruginous is the levels of iron oxide in the soil. Glauconitic is the levels of green iron potassium, greenish iron potassium mineral glauconite it's called. Siliceous grey, siliceous non-glauconitic soils. It's got lots of silica or quartz, let's say, quartz in the soil. The reddish soils, so coming back to the Munsell chart, these are with chroma of at least 3 and hues 5YR or redder. And the reddish soils have strong iron oxidation, well drained. Serpentinitic soils, exchangeable magnesium soils, which are high in magnesium effectively, but nutrient poor, chemically challenging actually for plants growing. Then we have ones that are imparted by the process of waterlogging. So we have salts that have been deposited, leading to saline. So soluble salts, sodium chloride and so on, sulfates are in the soil, very often in coastal or arid areas, poorly drained environments. Sulfidic soils, where there's iron sulfide or pyrite in the soil, and sulfuric as well, which is where sulfidic materials get oxidized, you get sulfuric acid forming, so very acid soils. And lastly, the sort of clay mineralogy, whether it's swelling, soils expanding and contracting clay minerals. I mentioned smectites. Sorry, there it is. I mentioned smectites, which cause that sort of volume change as the water gets in between the dinner plate stacking of the smectite minerals between wet and dry states, and kaolinitic soils dominated by the clay mineral kaolinite. So that's the sort of China clay tips, if you think in the regions of Cornwall. Very low nutrient holding capacity. So those are some of the factors to do with mineralogy. Let's just take an example now as we have here a soil type called Croft Pasco. And first thing just to mention is all the soils have names like this as well as numbers. You see the number is 274. Croft Pasco. So the soils are named after the first place they were observed. And in this case, you can see on the map there, it's down in the Lizard Peninsula. There's a link there, the QR code, that'll take you off to the page in our wonderful soils guide that will tell you all about Croft Pasco. But it's described as a coarse silty drift over serpentinitic loamy material with soft weathered ultra basic. So in that sentence, we have the information about the parent material, the mineralogy and the texture. So the description of the soil types in our books and in the LandIS system will give you that information. The next thing I just wanted to touch on, sort of coming towards the end here, is why are soils mapped, and why are soil mapping and soil classification linked closely? Well, let me just, sorry, I don't like animation. So the objective of general purpose soil mapping, of course, is trying to characterize areas of land that behave the same way. So you have similar soil functions. If we think in terms of ecosystem functions or soil services or soil functions, you're trying to have similar properties. We do know, of course, that these characteristics vary across the landscape, sometimes across a very short distance in the landscape. But we need to be able to define those characteristics. And of course, that is the basis of soil classification. And the soil series give us that sort of basic unit between the two. And the soil a map. And I think the point I just wanted to make here is the map scale that we use when we try to map soils, determines how much information you can pack into a particular polygon that represents those soils. And so we can differentiate between taxonomic classification, which is pretty much what I've been going through, and a cartographic classification, which might be a way that you group soils together into a polygon that's shown on the map. And the soil association is a cartographic construct, and the soil types and the major groups and subgroups and so on, that's a taxonomic consideration. So I think I'll sort of just bring my presentation to a close by showing a couple of slides here, which just show, first of all, actually the same area, but one is a detailed soil map. So this is a soil map. We call this a large scale, but what we're saying is you have a lot of detail on the map, and the polygons that you see are actually soil types, soil series. Each of those soil series, like for example 2250, is a discrete area, and the soils are on the basis of the criteria, the differentiating criteria that I've been discussing, the local geology, the topography, the land use, and so forth, have actually drawn a line and said this is the area that contains those soils. Every one of those soils typically has a pit that's dug, so 1 by 1 by 1 meter, an inspection pit, and the soil horizon is described. If we look at the same area at a much more coarse map, and this in fact is the national soil map at a scale of 1 to 250,000, you can see that you couldn't possibly fit in that detail sensibly on a map that's covering the whole nation. So what you have to do is you have to group soils together. And in this case, the grouping of soils that are typically occurring together in the landscape, well, these are called soil associations. So cartographically, it allows us to present a map showing perhaps the most dominant characteristics of that polygon on the ground. And the soil association also then contains the percentage likelihood or estimated likelihood of any of the soil types that occur together being present at any given point. So at any given, you have a percentage likelihood. So you'll see the soil associations have a group of soil series, each with a percentage associated with it. And just to sort of draw things to a close, or sort of the final slide here, let's just reflect here. So we've looked at the criteria for collecting soil, identifying soils in the field. There's a taxonomic classification, a hierarchical classification based on defined characteristics. We've been through some of those characteristics. I've tried to summarize the characteristics that allow us to come up with a classification from major groups all the way down to soil types. And just a brief discussion there about how those soils can actually be then translated onto a soil map, either on a sort of one-to-one basis with soil types if the scale permits, or through some form of grouping with soil associations if you're dealing with coarser maps. And at the end of this, we have basically a system which allows us to describe the soils in the landscape. And I did start by saying that our system here in England and Wales is a little bit different from other systems. So the Scots have a different approach. Other countries do different things. Taxonomy, for example, in the United States, in Canada, and so on. Other countries have different approaches. But all of the approaches are trying to achieve these sort of things here. So we're trying to understand the soil so that we can predict how they will behave under certain conditions. So if we're interested in soil processes, we're trying to actually capture and represent variations in this most extraordinary material soil as it extends across a landscape, and trying to understand how to make the best decisions for using that land, whether it's policy or whether it's agricultural or amenity or other sorts of decisions that we may take on land, where the best places to grow crops, where are less lands which could be perhaps built on, what about nature and biodiversity and so on. It's trying to understand environmental processes through an understanding of the derivation of the soils through millennia, really, of creating the differentiation in soils. And of course, having that classification allows us to produce robust, accurate mapping and support environmental management. So I think I'll sort of stop there. And if we had time, I don't know if we do, we could have a quick look at or I would invite you to have a quick look at the LandIS portal as well, which is where all this data sits. I'm sure Dan will have mentioned the location of that portal. But